It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Maya Williams, dressed casually in a black blazer and dark jeans, drove her modest car through the winding streets of her neighborhood. She had just finished a meeting with a few colleagues and was on her way home, mentally reviewing the details of an upcoming lecture she would give to her Harvard law students. Maya was known for her calm demeanor and sharp intellect, traits that had served her well as a professor at one of the nation's most prestigious law schools. But on this particular day, nothing could have prepared her for the encounter that would alter the course of her day, and soon, her entire life. The sound of sirens broke the quiet hum of the car's engine, making Maya instinctively pull over to the side of the road. The flashing lights grew brighter as she turned off the engine and placed her hands on the steering wheel. She was used to moments like these, though not necessarily for herself. As an African-American woman, Maya had heard plenty of stories about people of color being unfairly targeted during routine traffic stops. She had witnessed colleagues and friends recount similar experiences. Yet Maya was no stranger to handling difficult situations with poise. With one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the seat, she prepared herself for the exchange ahead, knowing well that she would have to stay calm and collected. The officer approached her window with the usual authority, a white male in his early 30s, wearing sunglasses and a crisp uniform. He leaned slightly toward the window and spoke with a tone of authority. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Maya looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "I'm not sure, officer. I wasn't speeding." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at his radar gun, then back at Maya, as if trying to gauge her. He seemed to take a moment to assess her, perhaps making judgments based on her appearance, but said nothing of it. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long before he finally spoke. "You were speeding. I clocked you going 10 miles over the limit. You'll be receiving a citation today," he said, the words almost mechanical, as if he had already decided on the outcome before she'd even spoken. Maya frowned slightly, but kept her expression neutral. "I understand you're just doing your job, officer, but I believe there was an error. I don't think I was speeding. Could you double-check your equipment or the circumstances?" The officer didn't seem to appreciate her suggestion. He glanced at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Maya could tell he wasn't interested in discussing the matter further. He was firm, unyielding. "I'm issuing the ticket anyway," he stated bluntly. "You can take it up with the judge in court." Maya felt a surge of frustration, but she forced herself to breathe, remembering her calm, measured approach to challenges. "All right. I'll accept the ticket. Thank you, officer." The officer handed her the citation, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than was necessary. There was something about his glance that Maya couldn't quite place, a hint of something condescending or perhaps dismissive. Regardless, she knew this wasn't the time for confrontation. As the officer walked back to his patrol car, Maya sat still in her seat for a moment, allowing the initial wave of annoyance to pass. She thought about the situation, about the officer's demeanor, the way he had dismissed her concerns so quickly, as though her voice had little weight. She had dealt with this type of bias before, in different forms, in different spaces. It wasn't something new to her, but there was something about this encounter that felt different. Maybe it was the officer's tone, or the sharpness with which he had issued the fine, that had struck her as unnecessary. With the citation in hand, Maya exhaled, collected herself, and drove away. The encounter seemed small, almost mundane at first glance. A routine traffic stop, a ticket issued, nothing out of the ordinary. But as she turned onto the main road, the unease lingered in her chest. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about the larger, uncomfortable reality of being judged based on the color of her skin, of being reduced to an assumption rather than a person. The thought gnawed at her as she made her way home, already mentally preparing for the upcoming court date. Little did she know, this seemingly trivial moment would ignite a series of events that would not only challenge her own experience with the legal system, but would bring to light some of the deeper, unspoken biases that still lingered in its corridors. And at the heart of it all would be a judge who, much like the officer, would underestimate her, not realizing that Maya Williams was no ordinary defendant. She wasn't just a woman receiving a fine. She was a Harvard law professor with a deep understanding of justice. A few weeks later, Maya Williams found herself walking into the small local courthouse, ticket in hand. It was an unremarkable building, one of those aging structures that didn't seem to have changed much over the years. The walls had that faint, musty smell of old wood and paper, and the air was thick with the quiet murmurs of others waiting for their cases to be called. Maya, however, walked through the doors with a sense of calm determination. She wasn't just there to contest a speeding ticket. She was there to prove a point, not only for herself, but for those like her who had been dismissed or belittled in similar situations. She was dressed professionally, her demeanor collected, but there was an underlying tension. She could feel the eyes of others in the courtroom as she made her way to the front. A few people glanced up from their seats, clearly surprised by her presence. Most people wouldn't expect a woman like Maya, well-dressed and confident, to be facing a simple traffic violation. But there she was, and the murmur of the room suggested curiosity. When her case was called, Maya stood tall and approached the defendant's table, making eye contact with the judge as she walked. The judge, Henry Davenport, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression, glanced up from his paperwork as she took her seat. Maya's presence didn't seem to faze him. He was already focused on the case before him. He cleared his throat and spoke in a firm, almost indifferent tone. "Ms. Williams, you're here to contest a speeding violation. How do you plead?" "I plead not guilty, Your Honor," Maya said, her voice steady and unwavering. She had rehearsed her words. She knew how this would go. She had seen it before. The assumption that people like her didn't belong in spaces like this, the tendency to dismiss her arguments without much consideration. She wasn't going to let that happen again. Judge Davenport didn't respond immediately. Instead, he briefly glanced down at the paperwork in front of him and made a show of flipping through the pages as though he was already disinterested. It was a subtle dismissal, but one that Maya caught instantly. His eyes never met hers for more than a split second, and he didn't seem particularly interested in hearing her side of the story. "Ms. Williams," he said finally, looking up at her, "I've reviewed the officer's report. It states that you were clocked at 10 miles over the speed limit. The citation is clear. What evidence do you have to dispute this?" Maya took a deep breath, her fingers lightly touching the edges of the ticket. She could feel the weight of the judge's eyes on her, the sharpness of his gaze. There was an undercurrent to his tone, a subtle assumption that she was unprepared, that her challenge would be weak. But Maya had come here to make her case. "Your Honor, I don't dispute the officer's reading of the radar gun, but I do dispute the circumstances under which I was ticketed. I was not speeding, and I believe the officer misjudged the situation. I was driving in a heavily congested area, and the traffic was moving slowly. I don't believe the officer took that into account," Maya explained, her voice measured and calm. Judge Davenport raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt her. He let her speak, though his posture suggested he wasn't taking her seriously. "Is that all, Ms. Williams?" the judge asked, his voice clipped, almost mocking in its casual tone. "Because that doesn't seem like a compelling reason to overturn a citation." Maya hesitated for a moment, sensing the judge's dismissiveness, but she pressed on. "Your Honor, I believe there was a failure to consider the context of the traffic flow. The officer didn't account for other factors, such as the cars in front of me or the limited visibility in the area. I was driving safely under the conditions, and I don't believe the ticket should stand." The judge glanced down at his notes, clearly unimpressed. "I see. Well, I've heard your argument. Based on the officer's report and my review of the facts, I find no reason to dismiss the ticket. I'm going to uphold the fine." The words stung. Maya felt a flicker of frustration, but she refused to let it show. She had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier. She knew that her credibility, her argument, hadn't been given a fair chance. Instead, the judge had dismissed her with a few short sentences. There was no real consideration of her points, no willingness to explore the situation with an open mind. The judge looked up again, his expression already shifting to the next case. "You'll receive your fine, Ms. Williams. Court is adjourned." As the judge banged his gavel, Maya stood silently for a moment. The frustration threatened to rise, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't going to let one moment, one biased decision, define her. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, her thoughts already turning to the next step. This wasn't over. If the judge wouldn't listen, she knew others would. Maya had more at her disposal than a speeding ticket, and she wasn't done yet. As she exited the courtroom, a quiet murmur followed her, a realization that there was more to this case than anyone had first believed. But Maya, walking with a purposeful stride, was already thinking about the bigger picture. As Maya left the courtroom, the weight of the judge's decision hung over her like a cloud, but she wasn't about to let it cloud her resolve. The dismissal, though not unexpected, stung more than she had anticipated. As she walked through the courthouse hall, she overheard whispers from some of the people still waiting for their cases. They seemed to notice her calm, confident stride and the unspoken tension in the air after her hearing. Maya knew the moment had been more than just a simple traffic violation. Something bigger was unfolding. She made her way out into the cold afternoon, the ticket still clutched in her hand, and headed to a nearby cafe to decompress. There she met with James, a colleague who had agreed to accompany her for moral support. James, a fellow law professor, was keenly aware of the toll these kinds of experiences took, especially in the face of prejudice. Over coffee, Maya recounted the events of the day, and James couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the judge's treatment of Maya and the treatment of other defendants. "Did he even listen to your side?" James asked, his brow furrowed in frustration. "It's like he'd already decided you were guilty from the start. The way he dismissed you, like you didn't even matter. It's frustrating." Maya sighed, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "It's the same pattern. I've seen it before in other spaces. People making assumptions based on my appearance rather than taking the time to understand who I am. And today, the judge's attitude was just a reflection of that." James nodded in agreement. "It's the same kind of bias that we're trying to teach students about in class. But when it hits close to home, it feels different, doesn't it?" Maya smiled, but it was more of a tight-lipped expression than anything else. "Yes, it does. And that's exactly why I'm not letting this go. This is bigger than me. It's about every person who's been dismissed because they didn't fit someone's narrow view of what respectable looks like." As they spoke, a local reporter who had overheard the conversation approached their table. The reporter had caught the tail end of their discussion and was immediately struck by Maya's composure and conviction. After a brief exchange, the reporter asked Maya if she would be willing to give an interview about the incident. Maya hesitated, her first instinct being to keep her life private, but she quickly realized that this was an opportunity to raise awareness about something that needed to be addressed. "I'll speak with you," Maya agreed, "but only if we focus on the larger issue here. It's not about the ticket. It's about bias in the justice system." As the reporter's pen hit the paper, Maya's story began to take on a life of its own. The next day, her interview was splashed across local news, bringing attention to her true identity, not just as a woman facing an unjust ticket, but as a respected professor at Harvard Law. Her credentials were laid bare for all to see, and suddenly, the case that seemed so trivial was anything but. The following morning, Maya's phone buzzed nonstop, an endless stream of notifications lighting up her screen. Text messages, emails, and social media alerts filled her inbox, all referencing an article published the night before. It was titled, "Harvard Law Professor Faces Off with Local Judge Over Speeding Ticket." Maya wasn't entirely surprised. During the interview with the reporter, she had made it clear that the issue wasn't just about the ticket. It was about the way the legal system sometimes treated individuals based on their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. She spoke candidly about the assumptions people made, how she had often been judged by her appearance rather than her qualifications. But seeing her story in print, with the headline emphasizing her role as a Harvard law professor, made her realize just how much more this moment had the potential to stir. As Maya scrolled through the article, she was surprised by the level of attention it had already garnered. The local news station had picked up the story, and soon it was spreading beyond the city, picked up by national outlets. Maya's calm demeanor during the traffic stop and her refusal to let the judge's assumptions slide had captivated many. And suddenly, her case became a symbol for something much larger than a simple speeding fine. It was a reflection of systemic bias in the justice system, a theme that resonated deeply with those who had felt marginalized or dismissed. Maya wasn't just a professor at Harvard. She was an expert in racial justice, having written numerous papers on the intersection of race, law, and societal structures. Her work had focused on dismantling biases that people like her often faced in legal spaces. But now, her expertise wasn't just theoretical, it was personal. The entire country was watching as the situation unfolded, eager to see how she would respond. That afternoon, Maya received a call from Eleanor, one of her colleagues from Harvard, who had read the article. Eleanor's voice was filled with both admiration and concern. "Maya, I can't believe the attention this is getting. But at the same time, I'm not surprised. You've always been one to stand your ground, and now the world is seeing that. You have an opportunity to really make a difference here." Maya smiled, though it was tinged with weariness. "I wasn't looking for attention, but I can't ignore this. The system isn't perfect, and it's time we had some real conversations about that." Eleanor agreed. "And you've become the face of that conversation. The way the judge treated you, dismissing your arguments without even a second thought, it's exactly what you've been teaching your students about in theory, but now it's happening to you." Maya took a deep breath, looking out the window of her office. "I've always believed that change starts with difficult conversations. If this is the moment I need to speak up, then so be it. But I'm not doing it just for me. I'm doing it for everyone who's been underestimated because of who they are." As Maya hung up the phone, she felt a sense of responsibility settling in her chest. She wasn't just a teacher of law anymore. She was living proof of the very issues she had dedicated her life to addressing. The conversation about bias, injustice, and the flaws in the system had just become real in a way that no textbook could teach. And now Maya knew she had a platform to spark that change. As the story of Maya's traffic ticket continued to dominate the headlines, it quickly became clear that not everyone was supportive of her stance. While some hailed her as a hero for standing up against systemic bias, others criticized her for drawing attention to what they viewed as a trivial matter. In online comment sections on social media, and even in some radio talk shows, Maya found herself at the center of a heated debate. A segment of the public, particularly those who had little understanding of the nuances of racial inequality, saw her actions as overly dramatic. "It's just a speeding ticket," some argued. "Why is she making such a big deal out of it?" Others took aim at her Harvard credentials, questioning why someone with such an esteemed position was even dealing with something as mundane as a traffic stop. Some went as far as to suggest that she was using her platform to play the race card and stir up unnecessary conflict. The online trolls, often anonymous, left disparaging comments questioning her qualifications, her integrity, and her motives. "Why doesn't she just pay the fine like everyone else?" One comment read, "She's just another entitled professor trying to get attention." It stung, but Maya didn't let it faze her. She knew that the vitriol came from a place of ignorance, and she refused to engage in the negativity. But alongside the backlash, Maya was also inundated with messages of support from across the country. People who had faced similar situations reached out to share their stories. A few students from her law classes sent emails thanking her for being a role model, while others expressed how proud they were that a professor they admired was standing up for justice. Colleagues from both within and outside Harvard echoed these sentiments, offering public statements in her defense. A prominent lawyer, Sarah Montgomery, who had worked with Maya on racial justice issues in the past, issued a statement that quickly gained traction. What happened to Professor Williams is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of the pervasive biases that exist within the system. She is using her position to shine a light on the inequality that too many people of color face in our society. Her bravery is inspiring, and we should all be grateful that she's taking a stand. Maya's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Judge Davenport's office. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered, unsure of what to expect. The receptionist on the other end explained that the judge had requested a meeting to discuss the matter further. Maya's initial instinct was to feel cautious, but she reminded herself of her purpose. This wasn't about a confrontation. It was about a conversation. She agreed to meet, knowing that this could be her opportunity to address the biases in the system head-on and perhaps change the way things were handled in the future. As she ended the call, Maya felt a mix of anticipation and resolve. The backlash, though harsh at times, hadn't deterred her. Instead, it had reinforced her conviction. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been unfairly judged, dismissed, or overlooked. And now she was ready to face whatever came next. A few days after the whirlwind of media attention, Maya found herself walking into the courthouse again, this time with a sense of purpose that was different from before. She had agreed to meet Judge Davenport in his chambers, and despite the tension surrounding the case, she was determined to approach the conversation with a clear, level-headed perspective. The buzz from the public had only intensified, but Maya had no interest in becoming entangled in the media circus. This meeting, she reminded herself, was about more than just a speeding ticket. It was an opportunity to address the root of the problem, the biases that plagued the legal system. Maya was ushered into Judge Davenport's office, a small but well-appointed room filled with dark wood furnishings. The judge, seated behind his desk, looked up from a stack of papers as she entered. His face was a mixture of apprehension and something more guarded, as if he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. He motioned for her to sit. "Professor Williams," Judge Davenport began, his tone measured but lacking warmth, "I wanted to meet with you in person, as your situation has garnered quite a bit of attention. I think it's important that we clear the air." Maya nodded, maintaining her composed demeanor. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Your Honor. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this directly." Judge Davenport shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "First, let me say that I respect your work as a professor at Harvard Law, and I certainly didn't intend to cause you any personal harm with my ruling. I simply followed the information presented to me, and I felt that the ticket was warranted." Maya could hear the subtle defensiveness in his voice, but she held her ground. "I understand, Your Honor, but it's not just about the ticket. It's about how situations like these often play out, especially for people of color. The way my argument was dismissed before I even had a chance to explain was troubling. And frankly, it wasn't an isolated incident. I've seen countless others face the same kind of treatment, though they may not have the platform to speak out about it." Judge Davenport looked at her, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. "You're saying that I acted with bias?" Maya paused, carefully choosing her words. "I'm not saying you acted maliciously, but yes, Your Honor. I believe there was an assumption made based on my appearance, on my background, and not on the facts of the case. And unfortunately, that's something many people of color face in our legal system." There was a long silence as Judge Davenport considered her words. Maya could see that he was uncomfortable, but whether it was because of her argument or because he hadn't expected her to call out the system so directly, she couldn't tell. "I see your point," he finally said, his voice softer than before. "Perhaps I didn't consider all the factors. I'll be the first to admit that my decision was made too quickly." Maya leaned forward slightly, her tone still calm but firm. "Your Honor, this isn't about me getting a ticket or not. It's about ensuring that the system is fair for everyone, regardless of who they are. I want to make sure that my students, and everyone who faces similar biases can trust that the legal system will be impartial. Judge Davenport nodded slowly. "I'll take what you've said into consideration, Professor, and moving forward, I'll make a conscious effort to be more mindful of these issues." Maya stood, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. This wasn't a grand victory, but it was a start. By speaking up, she had made him think, perhaps for the first time, about how his actions impacted those who didn't fit his assumptions. And for Maya, that was the first step toward a larger conversation about justice, equality, and accountability within the legal system. As she walked out of the courthouse, Maya felt a small sense of triumph. She had made a difference, not with grand gestures, but by holding firm to her values and challenging the status quo. It wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about making sure that everyone, regardless of their race or background, had an equal chance for fairness in the eyes of the law. And for the first time in a long while, Maya felt hopeful that change, however small, was possible. In the days following her meeting with Judge Davenport, Maya's world continued to shift in unexpected ways. Her public stance had ignited a firestorm of discussion, not just within the legal community, but throughout her local neighborhood, across social media, and even within her own circle of friends and colleagues. The fallout was both positive and negative, but Maya remained resolute. She knew the power of dialogue, and she had sparked one that needed to happen. One of the most heartening developments was the support she received from her students. When word spread about her encounter with Judge Davenport, many of them reached out, expressing their gratitude and admiration. Maya's teaching had always been about more than just textbooks and lectures. It was about fostering critical thinking and pushing boundaries. Now, her students were seeing their professor embody those very values in real time. "I just wanted to thank you for speaking up, Professor Williams," one of her students wrote in an email. "You've taught us that the law isn't just something we read about in books. It's something we live and experience. What you did was powerful." Her inbox filled with similar messages, many expressing that Maya's courage had inspired them to think more deeply about their own roles in the legal system. Some students even wrote about their personal experiences with bias, sharing stories of how they had been treated unfairly or overlooked, and how Maya's actions had given them hope that things could change. Maya was particularly moved by one message from Lena, a former student who had gone on to become a public defender. "Professor, I saw your interview, and I just wanted to say how proud I am to have been in your class. What you did, speaking out against what happened to you, but also addressing the larger issue of bias, reminded me of why I went into law in the first place. You showed me what it really means to fight for justice, no matter the cost." At the same time, Maya's rising visibility also invited some less supportive reactions. She was not immune to the backlash, and the more public her case became, the more voices there were questioning her motives. In local op-eds, some pundits argued that Maya was using her academic credentials to deflect from the reality that she had simply been caught speeding. The accusation of playing the race card resurfaced, with people questioning why a professor of her caliber would make such a public issue out of something so trivial. But Maya was undeterred. In many ways, the negative comments only served to strengthen her resolve. The backlash was exactly what she had anticipated. It was a reflection of the discomfort that many felt when the system they trusted was called into question. But it also proved the importance of speaking out, of shining a light on the subtle, often unnoticed biases that shape decisions every day. Maya was determined to continue this conversation, not just for herself, but for all the people who had been forced to remain silent out of fear or complacency. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. This wasn't just about one traffic ticket anymore. It was about changing the system, one conversation at a time. As she prepared for her next lecture at Harvard, Maya felt the weight of responsibility more than ever, but she also felt something else, a quiet sense of hope. The conversation had started, and it was far from over. Weeks passed, and the media frenzy surrounding Maya's traffic ticket continued to simmer. The judge's acknowledgement of bias had opened a door for a much-needed conversation about fairness in the legal system. For Maya, The path ahead was uncertain, but the momentum she had built felt significant. The world was paying attention, and she was ready to keep pushing for change. One of the most impactful developments came when the city's legal community, including local attorneys, civil rights groups, and law professors, began to rally behind Maya's cause. The Coalition for Justice Reform, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing systemic bias in legal proceedings, reached out to her to discuss potential collaborations. They had been following her story closely and saw an opportunity to partner with her on a larger campaign advocating for anti-bias training in local courts and police departments. Maya was both humbled and excited by the offer. This wasn't just a chance to change one person's approach to the law. It was an opportunity to impact the system at a broader level. The coalition invited Maya to speak at a community forum, where she could share her experiences and highlight the need for education and reform. As she prepared for her speech, Maya reflected on the journey that had led her to this point. She thought about the judge's dismissive attitude, the media attention, and the support from her students. She realized that the conversation she had started wasn't just about one isolated incident. It was about a deep-seated problem that affected countless people every day. The systemic biases that existed in law enforcement and the judicial system were not just academic concepts. They were real issues with tangible consequences. The day of the forum arrived, and Maya stood before a packed room of advocates, attorneys, and concerned citizens. As she addressed the crowd, she spoke not only about her personal experience, but about the broader implications of racial bias in the legal system. "What happened to me is not unique," she told them. "It's the story of countless individuals who have been judged before they even had the chance to explain themselves. It's about the assumptions made based on someone's race, gender, or socioeconomic background." Her words resonated deeply, and the room was filled with nods of agreement. The conversation shifted from one individual's story to a call for collective action. Maya's experience, once a point of contention, had become a powerful example of how personal stories could drive systemic change. As the forum concluded, Maya felt a sense of accomplishment, though she knew the work was far from over. The legal system, like many institutions, would not change overnight, but she was no longer just an academic voice in the classroom. She had become a catalyst for reform. And in that moment, she realized that the most important lesson she could teach her students wasn't found in any textbook. It was in the courage to stand up, speak out, and work toward a better, more just world. Maya knew that the road to change was long, but she also knew that every step, no matter how small, was a victory. And with each conversation, with each challenge, the conversation about bias and justice was moving closer to the real change that was needed.